Hello, this is Dr. J, and you're watching week 12 for the course Immigration. This week we'll be talking about strategies to police and fortify the US Mexican border as well as other borders. Read the article Mortality Before and After Border Wall Construction Along the US Mexico Border from 1990 to 2017. According to the article, the objectives are to evaluate changes in mortality in U.S. counties along the U.S. Mexican border, in which these are substantially new border wall constructions after the Secure Force Fence Act of 2006 relative to border counties in which there's no such border wall construction. So let's look and see if people are dying more if there's a wall built, or they're dying less if there's a wall built. The method of the study compiles a set of microdata from 1990 to 2017 and quasi-experimental difference in difference design, looking at similar qualities and comparing one another. They evaluate changes in overall causes of mortality, mortality from drug overdose, mortality from homicide in the 10 counties with substantial new border wall construction, as well as 11 counties with no such construction. You can think about the control experiment and the non-control experiment, right? So where are we introducing variables? We fit a linear model adjusting for population characteristics and county and year fixed effects with Bonaferroni adjustments. I'm not exactly sure what that is. Apologies for multiple comparisons. Sensitivity analysis included the addition of adjacent inland counties and modifications to the statistical model. So this is just a really complex analysis and comparison of various different sets of data in various different locations, with the main principal factor being the construction or not construction of a wall. The results relative to counties without substantial new border wall constructions, counties in which a substantial amount of new border wall has been constructed, exhibited a non-significant 0.02 percent point increase, 95% confidence interval, so pretty confident, in overall mortality after construction. So really, the border wall was not associated with any types of changes in deaths or homicides, and wall construction along the U.S.-Mexico border after the Secure Fence Act of 2006 was not associated with discernible changes in overall mortality. So I don't know exactly what arguments they're addressing here, but maybe the wall is a bad thing because it introduces all these negative factors and it causes death, or the wall will prevent death. Maybe I could see both arguments being made about the wall, and this study shows there's not really, the walls don't do anything. They just don't do anything. They don't necessarily make things better or worse. They just sort of make concrete the social and political differences that we have. Going back to this sort of main book we're working with this semester, or this end part of the semester, chapter 1 for Court of Injustice, you can see a analysis of the case of Omar, and this is just one example of an immigration court that I took off the internet. Immigration court, different than family court, different than federal court, different than all different types of courts. It's very unique, specific type of jurisdiction where judges administer principally these deportation orders. And this is sort of a big issue that we're going to see throughout the book. Omar is at the border. We can ask, how do we construct youth through borders? This is just also an image that we see. It's taken off the internet on the screen here. It was taken in 2017. There were a number of family separations, and children were getting sent to different detention centers than their adult parents. And this became very controversial, and some very young kids were asked to testify for themselves in court without any type of representation present. And there's a bunch of photos about this sort of circulating. Immigration laws are getting tougher on children, according to the author of Courts of Injustice, and we also see immigration laws getting more punitive. So the laws are getting tougher on children, so focusing on a specific population. And we also see that it's going from possibly just deportation to actually circulating people through the criminal justice system and punishing them, trying to find ways to deter them to not immigrate by punishing them with jail time or other types of penalties. Juvenile justice system, if we look at the history of it, it sort of started in 1899 in New York, and we see it go to other places by the 1920s. Illinois started in Illinois in 1899, and then it goes into places like New York. New York's very important for the book, taking mostly at the immigration court in New York. See, it started in 1922. Once again, a unique juvenile justice system, one that is designed specifically to address issues of minors, of people who are seen in tender ages. The goal was rehabilitation rather than punishment, and seeing delinquency as something that could be cured through reform, through schooling, through incarceration as a young age. And then in the 1970s, we see more laws sending children to criminal court, which also more or less sends them to adult court. Children as young as 13 can be held responsible for murder, for example. In 1978, we see the juvenile offender law. 16-year-olds, for the most part, are being tried as adults across the country at this point. And then we see that murder at the age of 13 gets divested from family court or from juvenile court and then goes into adult court often. And the idea of discretion is very important as well. So you can see here, especially in the United States, we have this sort of state-by-state difference, statutory exclusion. So we can see that there's very specific differences, very specific written laws, depending on juvenile age of jurisdiction and transfer to adult court. So there's some very specific lines in the yellow here. If we look at the purple, we see judiciary control of transfer. So there might be a judge that has some discretion. If we look at the dark gray, we see that there is some prosecutorial discretion. So the prosecutor can decide whether or not they want to try the case in adult or juvenile court. And then statutory exclusion and prosecutorial discretion. There's both rules mandating specific processes for children, as well as opportunities for the prosecutors to say you are going to be going to one court or the other. We got some dots and some stars there. Once an adult, always an adult. So the idea that you sort of go into the criminal justice system, and the moment that you are being treated as an adult under the eyes of the law, even if you're under 16, that means that you're going to be subject to those laws and you can't go back to juvenile court. And then we also see that star, some of the places like North Dakota, I'm just seeing at the very top of the screen, Washington and Maine all have a star, and that's the number indicates upper age of jurisdiction in each state. So once you get up to 17 in Washington, once you get up to 17 in Maine, that is going to be the uppermost limit that a juvenile court can do anything with a person, and goes to adult court after that. In the 1990s, we see this type of language really clamping down on the children going through the criminal justice system. We see this double threat that gets talked about, the super predator. The first predator is this sort of nascent, urban, racialized youth that is threatening gang activity, and then the other predator is the illegal, quote-unquote, illegal alien or illegal immigrant. And so we have these sort of predator aliens circulating around. Some of the people who were the most prominent proponents of this super predator term were on the Democratic side of the aisle. Something might be very surprising for people looking at politics in the 2020s, where most Democrats seem to embrace the abolitionist anti-police stance. You see people like Clinton and Biden were directly responsible for authoring some of the most significant mass incarceration bills in the 1990s. And here's just a quote from Hillary Clinton, one that she had to apologize for when she ran for president in 2016. She was, at this time, the first lady under Bill Clinton's administration, and she was giving a very active role in trying to pass this type of criminal justice legislation, very unprecedented for a first lady. But according to Hillary Clinton, and you can look the video up of her saying this, they are not just gangs of kids anymore. They are often the kinds of kids who are called super predators, no conscience, no empathy, really dehumanizing these juvenile defenders. A very different stance than what we see 100 years earlier, where rehabilitation was the focus. Supreme Court's ruling that youth includes diminished decision-making abilities, lack of foresight, impulse control, and a positive potential for rehabilitation. So when we are considering whether or not to use that discretion, that prosecutorial or that judicial discretion to go into the family court or the adult court, we're going to see if there's this youthful characteristic of diminished abilities to make decisions, lack of foresight, impulse control, and a positive potential for rehabilitation. Some other acts around 1996, we see the EDPA, Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act of 1996, the law enacted in response to the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing, which did have nothing to do with immigrants and actually was perpetrated by people who were anti-immigrant, aimed to deter terrorism, provide justice for victims, and streamline the federal death penalty process. This also allowed for immigrants to be tried on terrorism laws. The Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act of 1996, a U.S. federal law that made significant changes to immigration laws. It was designed to strengthen immigration enforcement, including border control, interior enforcement. This is when we start seeing Border Patrol working further and further in from the border, hundreds of miles in that time, and penalties for undocumented migrants who commit crimes. So added penalties, augmenting already severe statutes. Welfare Reform Act restricted eligibility for certain public benefits, particularly for legal migrants entering the U.S. after 1996. So the idea of welfare and the government not wanting to provide welfare to immigrants. Some tactics that we see the broader criminal justice system use when it comes to immigrants. First, going after the worst violent criminals. So if you go and commit a violent act and you go to jail and you're on trial, the Border Patrol and ICE might be very much interested in detaining you and making you wait in a immigrant detention facility rather than in that criminal justice facility. Aggravated felonies lost their chance to present evidence in front of an immigration judge. So you used to be able to at least present evidence. We see this as sort of a trajectory with immigration judges. They have consistently less opportunity to decide anything, use discretion, and the statutes or the rules guiding the immigration court as they're written into law more or less require just a perfunctory reading of the accusations and a decision on whether those accusations are sufficient for deportation or cancellation of a visa. See the idea of folk devils and criminal aliens? I have this image here from a 1990s video game, Alien vs. Predator. Maybe you all know it, maybe you don't. It's a pretty fun game, at least it was at the time, sort of science fiction. One of the monsters are called aliens, another monster is called Predator. Sort of a funny thing to do, but we can see this sort of image of two moral panics coming together and intersecting, sort of a Venn diagram, right? We have two different types of monsters that are being created by the media and in the political discourse. And what the author, what Saylor argues is that there needs to be case study to understand how these moral panics create really biased stereotypes and how these biased stereotypes are more or less what the law is founded in, and case studies looking at the meaningful gradations in accountability. So individuals having very particular reasons for possibly overstaying their visa. Legal assistance has been made less accessible to illegal aliens, and this is all obviously a controversial term for some people. Illegal aliens, calling someone illegal, is sort of this derogatory phrase that has circulated throughout society. And there's also the term undocumented residents and things like that. But these types of more derogatory terms have really been embedded in the legal system. And you can see that there are broad applications of the denial and cancellation of visas based off of moral character. Most recently, we've seen a lot of student protesters get expelled and subsequently deported from the country, pretty much for having a moral character that opposes the current elected government. Can also see some cases referenced in the book where people are getting too many parking tickets, and that's enough to meet the common understanding of poor moral character. It might seem sort of like a nothingness to many people, especially when the consequences mean you might be separated from your family, but judges and the immigration courts consider things like that as a reflection on other types of moral character issues. These are just some paraphrased quotes and facts that I found interesting from the book. The Secure Fence Act of 2006 led to the construction of 548 miles of new border wall along the 1,954-mile U.S. border. Covers about 1/4 of it. You can think all those big holes that you got in between that, right? And there's sort of this longer process to fill up those gaps. The wall's construction resulted in a 0.4% reduction in the number of Mexican citizens living in the United States, approximately 50,000 people. So a lot of political effort, a lot of money spent to prevent 50,000 people out of the millions that might be coming in and out of the United States illegally every year. It sort of seems, once again, these border walls might not be a really good solution to the issue. Low-skilled workers in the U.S. experienced an increase in annual income per capita by 28 cents. So you spend all this money on the border, might even get taxed more than 28 cents for border security, and then it only gives you more or less a quarter back, a little change in your pocket, right? Due to fewer low-skilled Mexican workers entering the country and challenging the labor market. High-skilled workers saw a decline in annual income per capita of 2.73% as the result of the same change. So there are some problems here, I think. When we start cramping down on immigration, it's causing some possible negative effects. I think we can look also critically and say, like, okay, is this a direct result of these acts, or is this just a coincidence? Is it a correlation or a coincidence? The Congressional Research Service reported that after fencing and other resources were deployed in San Diego, California, there was a decrease in the number of apprehensions of individuals attempting to cross the border. So there are some anecdotal facts that support that border walls can have their intended effects. Moral borders versus physical borders. I think this is important. This is an image from El Salvador. Something to think about, the distinction between the moral outrage that is associated with immigration and illegal immigration, and then the physical boundaries that those metabolize into. We have these sort of symbolic issues that become concrete. And here the image from El Salvador, I think, is just a great example of that. We see a line of people just being paraded, and it's sort of providing this moral panic. Feels like something is being a little subverted for some people here when we see any type of human being treated like this. What are walls then? What are the direct and indirect conditions? We can go back to that article I started the lecture with today, looking specifically at the secondary health effects, mortality, social effects, cultural effects, political effects associated with developing this wall. And I think that's a broader question we can ask for the remainder of the course. Not just, is it a good or bad thing, but rather, what impact does it have on a broader society? The uniqueness of the US Mexican border, according to the article, the US Mexico border region has a distinct population health profile shaped by a diverse and mobile population with various economic and cultural characteristics. There isn't just one type of migrant going back and forth. There isn't just one type of health issue that's defining these urban and rural spaces across thousands of miles. Over the past 2 decades, certain populations in this region have experienced lower rates of health insurance, poor physical health, high prevalence of vector borne infections, food insecurity, chronic disease. The US Mexican Border Health Commission, established in 2000s, is also a very specific organization meant to address these very unique challenges. Recently, the Commission identified poverty as a key driver of poor health in the region. No surprise. Poverty is an indicator of poor health more or less throughout the entire world. Many border countries face higher unemployment rates compared to both the border states and the national average. So, this also is a direct result of possibly some other secondary economic and environmental factors. Environmental degradation, including water shortage and poor air quality, has also been associated with adverse health outcomes in the region. And the southern border is a desert. It's very arid. There's not a lot of water, anyways. So I would just like to open up question: is the environment coincidental, or is the environment being somehow modified artificially by this wall, causing degradation and leading to health outcomes that are negative? All these are, I think, open-ended questions that the authors don't even get into well in the article. They're mostly focused on this mortality issue. Similar studies to this article, only 2 studies, to our knowledge, have examined the health consequences of U.S. Mexico border wall construction. One focused on mortality in Mexico, so just a different side, revealed that an additional 1,000 deaths could be attributed to border wall construction between 2007 and 2011, owing to an escalation of violence in Mexican localities after construction. It became a lot more difficult to cross the border. Real estate to cross the border became a lot more precarious, became a lot more strategically viable to go and target your enemies if you're a drug cartel, for example. So you just see this sort of concentration, people have their backs against a wall kind of thing. The other study showed that border infrastructure in response to the Secure Fence Act had no impact on property or violent crime rates in the counties in which the wall was built. So one study sort of shows, okay, there was this drug war that took place. I think we could also ask if that drug war was the result of the fence or if there's the result of secondary things. I will not get into details, but you can look at the Obama administration's fight against the drug war. It was rather distinct from the fight against immigration at this time, even though both in the Obama administration were pretty big policy priorities. But the drug war had a lot of really problematic episodes. One example was the Obama administration. The DEA bought guns in the United States, sold them to drug traffickers in order to sort of plant a virus and track them around the world and see how they sort of circulated. And then people ended up using the guns to kill people. So the U.S. government more or less sold guns to drug dealers who killed people, right? So, there's sort of like a lot of different factors we consider, and we can look at the case studies, and we can just look at the broader strategies outside of immigration that might also have had some negative impacts. If we look at the definition of exposure, right, this article is ultimately looking at mortality rates, and exposure to the wall is going to be considered to be a type of comorbidity in this study. Is being exposed to the wall the same thing as being exposed to a virus? Exposure to the wall construction is defined as the presence of any human-made barrier at the U.S.-Mexico border at the county level. So these smaller units, a little bit larger than the city, smaller than the state. Fencing types are sometimes varied. You see vehicle fencing, metal poles to block vehicle traffic. You see pedestrian fencing, various materials including corrugated steel and barbed wire. We see a corrugated steel pedestrian and pole vehicle crossing at the start, and a Jeep that just sort of gets some stilts to go over. We can see different types of time periods when relating to the exposure. We can see pre-intervention, so before the wall was built in 2006 and earlier. We can see post-intervention after the wall was completed and the policy was more or less in full effect after 2009. County classification, we can see treated counties if we're looking at the idea of exposure. Being treated by the county is possibly to be the one where at least a 25% increase in border wall construction from 2006 to 2009, and then control counties where all other border counties that were not treated, that did not have a significant level of wall construction. San Diego County in California and El Paso in Texas were excluded due to different types of sort of urban construction that took place for various different projects. There were 10 walled, 10 unwalled counties, inland counties adjacent to the counties were also assessed. So this was sort of that generalized, looking at the somewhat different variables and differences between these groups. So you have these rather large data sets that they looked at, and this is just a visualization of what we can see. The treated counties are the ones in the darkest shade right along the border. The treated inland counties, so those are the ones that have a significant presence or relationship and connection to the treated border counties. And then we have controlled border counties where there wasn't a significant wall that was getting built. So stretches across a pretty significant and all-encompassing set of regions. Homicide rates per thousands in comparable cities. I think this is an interesting stat that is talked about. So we see San Diego on the border, El Paso on the border, Laredo, Brownsville, McAllen, all on the border. All very similarly sized cities to non-border cities. Dallas is sort of in the center of the state. Milwaukee, my hometown, is on the other side of the country in the north. Richmond in Virginia. I have actually taught there. Little Rock, Arkansas, Hartford, Connecticut, all significant miles away from any type of border. And we also see that similar populations to these border states. And actually, if we look, the border's significantly safer than the interior of the country. This is also just a little demonstration of the mortality rate in these treated and untreated counties. And it more or less parallels one another. I can't really get into a whole lot of details over the years and why different peaks and stuff like that happens along the graph, but what you see is that there's more or less a symmetry between the treated and the untreated counties, and that mortality rate more or less stays the same. In this study of counties near the US-Mexico border before and after the construction of border walls, the authors generally found no statistically significant association between border wall construction and mortality. Super important conclusion if you want to know what the conclusion of this article is. This lack of association was robust to several sensitivity analyses, including variations in the statistical model and the sample. And once again, we have this difference thing where we're looking at different impact factors that might sort of be parallel or similar to one another. The exception was a modest relative increase in homicide deaths associated with wall construction in the sample that included inland counties. And I think you can also ask, was it associated with wall construction or did it sort of overlap with a few other different factors? But I think the authors are coming from a good place in making that statement. They're not really making too far of a reach. Another graphic I found, I think it's interesting. It's more than a wall, thinking about that social and that moral factor. We can see here the border industrial complex. I've spoken a little bit about that in lecture, and we've read a few different things about that, but you can see a lot of money circulating. It has nothing to do with immigration or the construction of a wall, these sort of political lobbying efforts. You can see that legislation has consistently been dominant in this discussion, and the judiciary and the policing forces responsible have mostly deferred to the politics of the time to define the strategies and the tactics. We can see there's a revolving door also of leadership in the Border Patrol straight to this lobbying sector where they can make 10 times their salary overnight by going and bugging politicians up in Washington and going trying to get them to get more money to the private industries. This includes Boeing and Lockheed Martin and a few very well-known companies. And then you can also see that there is hundreds of deaths and disappearances associated each year with the border crossing. So there are some very deadly factors, even though there's not any increased association with border wall construction or anything like that. Still, nonetheless, we can assume that people have died because they've been crossing the border. Contributing factors, we can see some corporate profits from border militarization, long history of booming budgets for border militarization as well. So not only the onus of profit making that most corporations and private industries prioritize, but also an increasing amount of money coming to those industries. And the consolidation of this border industrial complex, thinking about that revolving door between private industry and ICE or Border Patrol leadership, that's just one example, one of the more significant examples of the consolidation of this industrial process. Some other walls just to consider, thinking about patrolling the walls. There's a bunch of different types of strategies we have. So this is just one illustration of some of the technology. Talked about that in previous weeks. This is showing that there is pretty extensive sections that are covered by the border wall, and this includes all-weather patrol roads, you have the corrugated fencing, you have LED lighting, you might have pedestrian places to get through, you're going to have sensor towers every 12 kilometers, you're going to have automated vehicle gates, and you're going to have levee walls, and you're going to make it difficult for people to come over on foot. Some other different types of ways we can sort of conceptualize the patrolling of this border. This is a great place for natural wildlife. We have these different very rare species here, and then we also have, if you look here in gray, the Barry M. Goldwater Range, which is more or less this like no light range. You're not allowed to have any artificial light in that range, or there's very limited artificial light that's permitted, and it's supposed to be sort of this like light-free pollution zone. So you can see all these animals existed in this region before the border. So you have to create mechanisms for them to be able to cross the border without too much difficulty, or else you might be contributing to their extermination. Similarly, you can look at indigenous populations that exist from Pueblo, Colorado, all the way down to Puebla, Mexico, and you're going to see some very similar cultural traditions extending along that 1,000-mile route. And a lot of indigenous reservations exist, and they straddle the border. And so there's another type of problem with the border wall construction. If you look here in tan, it says tribal lands, for example. That's one example. Looking at different borders, we have the Northern Border Security Project coming out of Saudi Arabia. Got all that Saudi oil money and the U.S. military support. The Saudi Arabians provided a lot of military infrastructure to the U.S. as they waged wars in Iraq and helped liberate Kuwait in the 1990s, and then went into places like Syria after the Iraq War in the 2010s. Now they're building their own U.S.-style border facility. You can see some of the technology that's on there. It looks very similar to what is in the U.S.-Mexican border. I think there might be some very similar concerns. Big, long stretch of desert, very difficult to patrol. There's some illegal activity coming back and forth. It's also a security concern between Iraq and Saudi Arabia, which don't necessarily get along all that well. You can look on the graphic here. You got a lot of different US and European security technologies. So 40 watchtowers equipped with Airbus. That's the European air manufacturer. Spexer 2000 radars, day-night cameras, 7 command and control centers, 28 separate communication towers, and 32 military response stations. You have several different types of barriers, sand berms, as well as these sort of metal and manufactured barriers. You have also a huge number of vehicles, and those are Humvees, so those are US manufactured vehicles as well, and all those peripheries, all those extra technologies associated with the US vehicles are also most likely put in profits in US coffers. Something to think about. Turkey's border security. This is on the more or less opposite part of the Middle East. If we look at this southern part of Turkey, it's a highly militarized border. It became a very problematic place during the Syrian civil war. A lot of refugees were going across here. It also became a place where there was fears there was going to be more direct military conflict between groups like ISIS and the Turkish military, which is NATO, North Atlantic Trade Organization, so pretty problematic. You also have in other parts, particularly when you get closer to Iraq and in this in this eastern part of Syria, you have the Kurdish states that are somewhat antagonistic to both Syria and Turkey has limited control there. So you see this desire to sort of create this fortified border, this sort of fortress, as well as to try to control migration that might be associated with the broader conflict that has been erupting in the Middle East for the last forever. Another wall, much older one that has been already torn down. You have West Berlin and East Berlin. You had a very specific post World War II political arrangement where the east of Germany and half of Berlin would be left under the control of the of the communist Soviet Russians. And then the west half of Berlin, which is separated from the west half of Germany. So Berlin's sort of an island in the middle of East Germany. The west part of Germany became its own democratic capitalistic state. And at one point in the 1950s, the diplomatic situation soured between the East and the West, between the Soviets and the Americans. And the Soviets started to fortify the sections between East Berlin and West Berlin, and the Brandenburg Gate, which is this sort of 18th century monument to Prussian victories, became a symbol for Hitler, a symbol for the Soviet conquest, and then a symbol of this divided Germany. You can look at, here's the Brandenburg Gate here. It initially started off as just sort of an impromptu barbed wired fence that was meant to prevent people from just running across the border. They stacked it with a bunch of Soviet military soldiers, and eventually the US would match that type of force response, and you just see this sort of eventual development of a more concretized wall. So this is a diagram of it. You'd have these huge 302 watchtowers along the urban center. You see sort of a forest sometimes in between. You'd see high walls. You'd see street stakes, so these sort of metal walls. You'd see a lot of soldiers, 14,000 soldiers, a lot of dogs, German shepherds, and things like that, bunkers in case there was outright conflict between the two sides. There was always this threat of just like all-out war. It was meant to prevent East Germans from fleeing to the West, but there was also this sort of added threat that there was going to be all-out conflict between the Soviet Union and the Americans, and that was also going to be sort of played out between East and West Germany. There's about 260 people wounded, 230 were killed, so it was often a shoot on sight type of thing, and then 5,000 people escaped through the wall. You can see here, 1945, U.S. Red Army captures Berlin. U.S. shows up a little bit later. The Soviets start blockading West Berlin in the 1940s. They construct a much more ambitious wall in the 1950s. JFK says one of his favorite lines, Ich bin ein Berliner, I am a Berliner, calling for the tearing down of the wall almost 20 years after the war. From there, you see a gradual push towards disarmament and a lot more talk about reintegration. And in the 1980s, and Ronald Reagan gets a lot of credit for this, he goes to the wall and he says, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And he's talking to the Soviet premier, who was more or less responsible for liberalizing the Soviet state and for also dismantling this sort of imperial Russian communist empire. And he was also responsible, Gorbachev was also responsible for giving the order to get that wall down. So it was a pretty big. You can see just some of the stories. You can look up. There's countless stories. All these escapes are just very daring escapes. People even tried hot air balloons. This is what it looked like in the 60s. So more or less when it was built up in the initial stages, it was integrated right into the city. And this is what it looked like in 1989. Lovely fashion there that we can see. But more or less what happened was there was a mistake on the East German side. They declared a holiday, that there was like this sort of free travel holiday, and a bunch of people just bum rushed the wall. And then on both sides, people just started going around the wall and trying to tear off pieces of it. And you can see the broader social movements. This is right after they had a significant amount of the wall torn down, and you can see some borders there, some border guards there. But this is pretty chill environment. You can see "Long live the Dalai Lama," right? You can sort of see these global peace activists stepping out, and people just wanting to see an end to this Cold War that was 50 years after World War II, and just sort of dividing families still, and just became this very divisive thing. And so now it's a monument. You can still go see the Berlin Wall, but there's only a few sections left. Most people just tore it down and they reintegrated the city. Older walls yet. We could talk about walls all day, but I think it's interesting just to think some of these big walls we have, and thinking about the secondary and tertiary effects, the moral and the physical qualities of borders, as well as maybe the environmental and the biological aspects of the border. Great Wall of China has its own ecological zone. All of these bricks that were used to construct the wall, ceramic bricks that were used to construct the wall, are perfect mediums, perfect environments to breed specific types of bacteria, moss, leafy plants, as well as helping with other types of soil fortification and root fortification. So there's been some significant amounts of studies to show that these walls do have some impact on the broader environment. This is just another environment: reduced wind, reducing rain drop, kinetic energy. So it's sort of keeping that soil, anti-infiltration. We don't see as much water just sort of seeping into the soil and making it loose. And then we can see that there is a biocrust in this sort of fortress biocrust that has a different type of quality. So different than and distinct from the broader environment. Supposedly, the Great Wall of China is one of the few structures you can see from space, or at least one of the oldest structures you can see from space. You can see that it also inhabits this wide-ranging environment. It goes from the ocean through this huge mountain range to the Gobi Desert. So this just huge environment that is there to consider. Many people, there's all these debates. We don't really know exactly what conflict the wall was built for. We don't know if it was built as sort of a prestige project for the emperor, if there was an actual conflict that they wanted to prevent, if they wanted to sort of just prevent the passage of nomadic people, if they wanted to contain people on their side of the border, if there was an actual all-out conflict that it was meant to be part of. And I think one of the more interesting concepts is this is during an early era, 2,000 years ago, when states were being formed. And what's one of the pinnacle aspects of the state is the collection of taxes. You have money and the collection of taxes. Well, if you can't pay taxes, what are you going to do? You're going to have to go and work on the wall. And what we see on the Great Wall of China, a lot of the engineers and a lot of the people that worked at the wall were just buried right beneath the wall and sort of entombed in the wall. And so there's some evidence that there might have been these sort of marginalized workers that were either enslaved or coerced to go work, and they were using their sort of tribute. Instead of paying taxes, they had to go and serve the state to build this wall. Some new discovery gaps in the wall create more mysteries about why it was built. There's some missing sections due to rushed building by Genghis Khan amid fears of Genghis Khan. So, what happened was it built to prevent this invasion by Genghis Khan 1,000 years later? Possibly some sections where openings may have been also used to monitor people in border zones. So anytime you build a fortress, any good fortress, it's always best to let them come into your fortress, and then you can surround them. You can sort of get them into the position you want. The Aztecs did that. A few other very well known. I think the Chinese and the Japanese were also known for doing that, sort of creating these sort of constructed traps as people tried to invade these fortified locations. So possibly this could have just been a way to say, okay, you can cross the border. We don't really like you around here, but if you do cross, you got to come through our gate, and you got to come at this time of year. Possibly. A much more egalitarian and sort of positive, less violent explanation for it. I think it's interesting just to sort of open our minds about what possibly walls are built for and what type of social and political justifications they have. Once again, there is this idea of the Mongolian Arc, which was built 1,000 years after the first wall, and then we see some other walls. So it's not really like a cohesive border zone that's getting built. And you can just assume when you see all these different phases of construction and where they overlap with the border, that it doesn't necessarily 100% align with this strategy of maintaining a solid, coherent border. The border might have changed. The reason for the border might have changed. The different political justifications for the border may have changed. And then the wall was most likely built not to stop armies such as those of Genghis Khan, but rather to stop small-scale invasions from local tribes, as well as to monitor and control their movement and the movements of local nomadic people. The walls did not have very extensive visual command over their environment. You would assume that there would be some more extensive visual command if this idea of policing the border was an important quality for the Chinese. So we have all these different reasons for maybe doubting this idea that the Chinese state was trying to protect itself from this overwhelming force. And rather, what we see possibly is that this was just a simple method of control that might reflect some of our customs and immigration processes of the day. Did the Great Wall even work? The purpose of the Great Wall, it's an iconic structure, 13,000 miles, so it's a huge structure. Possibly built for defense, possibly built for control, possibly built for trade regulation. The design evolved from the 7th BC, when it was made from packed earth, to the Ming Dynasty, which is thousands of years later, built with bricks and stone, so much more durable. And then you can see the structural features. There's high enough to deter invaders, wide enough for soldiers to move along, and supposedly could march a column down this stairway. Different sections were not continuous. There was breaks and stops, so this is sort of problematic. And the most famous sections were the ones that were built in the later stages. So what were the later justifications? They probably could have been very different than the justifications for 1,000 years earlier. Some of the building challenges, there was these manpower and resources, required significant labor and materials. And then there was some harsh conditions. This went from the desert to the mountains. Became a cultural symbol and influence over time. During the 1970s, there's some indication that China really bumped up the reasoning and the importance of the Great Wall to sort of stake a claim in global cultural history and have a point of pride. And they started reforming the wall and advertising the wall and taking world leaders to the wall. And during this time also, the U.S. President Nixon called the wall the Great Wall of China. And this is supposedly one of the initial ways times that it was called the Great Wall. It might have just been called the Wall of China, right? So, in conclusion, walls are human creations and have social conditions imposed on them. I think that's something we can see the physical and the mechanical and how it contrasts with the cultural and the political. And then the Great Wall's purpose and design, as well as the Berlin Walls, as well as the Mexican US border wall, purpose and design reflect the changing needs and contributions of various dynasties, political orders, and they also symbolize resilience and cultural heritage, the people that continue to try to subvert those walls and cross those walls.